thread of doubt, thin but strong, had been weaving itself through Ethan's thoughts for weeks. If Liam didn't love him, why had he agreed to be with him in the first place? It was a simple question that seemed to unravel into 1,000 more complicated ones. The whole situation was simple, really. Ethan just had a talent for making simple things disastrous. He wanted to come out to his parents and then, eventually, bring Liam home to meet them. But Liam refused. Ethan understood the hesitation in theory. While marriage equality was the law of the land, acceptance wasn't a switch that flipped overnight, especially for a generation that saw the world in stricter binaries. That was precisely why Ethan had suggested he go first, to break the ground. He had played the scene out in his mind countless times. His parents, with their severe and exacting brand of love, would be rigid. They had been that way for over 2 decades, their praise scarce and their control absolute. He knew they would likely demand he break up with Liam immediately. But he also knew their limits. They wouldn't resort to histrionics or physical force, nor would they waste energy on futile efforts like conversion therapy. And since Ethan hadn't truly lived in their home for years, they had little leverage. They were pragmatists above all else. They would eventually accept a reality they could not change. He wasn't their only child, not the sole vessel for their dynastic hopes. He was financially independent, save for the fact that he was currently living in a condo in San Francisco they had purchased as an investment years ago. It was a temporary arrangement, but it was the only string they still had attached to him. He figured that if he gave them fair, their eventual meeting with Liam would be, at worst, an exercise in thinly veiled disapproval, not an outright expulsion. But Liam's reaction had been anything but pragmatic. It was Valentine's Day. They were at a restaurant with low lighting and hushed tones, the kind of place where reservations were a competitive sport. Liam had, for once, not been working late. The promise of an evening together had sent a frantic rhythm through Ethan's chest. He had booked this specific table weeks in advance, a secret he kept because Liam's work as the co-founder of a burgeoning tech startup was all-consuming. Ethan didn't want to be the kind of partner who demanded time that didn't exist. He just wanted to celebrate their first Valentine's Day together. He hadn't wanted extravagant gifts or a grand getaway. He just wanted this. He'd even arranged with the pastry chef to have a small cheesecake brought out instead of their individual desserts. A quiet nod to the birthdays they had both missed due to work and travel. It was the peak of his romantic imagination. But as his friend Chris would later say, Ethan had a chronic inability to read a room. He mistook the quiet ambience for genuine peace, Liam's polite silence for contentment. He saw the perfect moment to broach the subject. He asked Liam how he felt about their relationship. Liam, who had been prodding a piece of seared ahi with a silver fork, looked up. A small, rare smile touched his lips as he asked Ethan what he thought. Before Ethan could process the warmth in that smile, he blurted out his plan about telling his parents, about Liam meeting them. The change was instantaneous. The smile vanished. Liam's posture, once relaxed, became rigid. He refused, his voice sharp enough to cut through the restaurant's gentle hum. Several heads from nearby tables turned in their direction. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up Ethan's neck. He could only manage a weak why. Liam didn't answer. He just stood up and walked out, leaving Ethan alone at the table for two. A waiter hesitated nearby before cautiously approaching to ask if he still wanted the cheesecake. Ethan, feeling the weight of a dozen pitying gazes, could only shake his head. He mechanically finished his risotto, delaying his departure, hoping to avoid an immediate and awkward reunion at home. When he finally went to pay the bill, he found that Liam had already taken care of it. Outside, the crisp February air bit at his skin. Liam was waiting by a street lamp, not looking at his phone but just holding it, turning it over in his hands. He had an unlit cigarette dangling from his lips. He saw Ethan emerge and started walking toward the parking garage without a word. Ethan had to jog to catch up. He searched for something to say, studying the back of Liam's head for any sign of his mood. As if sensing his stare, Liam took the cigarette from his mouth and spoke without turning, his voice flat. He stated that he wasn't smoking it, just holding it. Ethan, feeling foolish, just nodded. Liam made a noise of exasperation, and they drove home in a heavy, suffocating silence. A few people online had wondered why Ethan was in such a hurry to involve his parents. The truth was, his family was starting to push, making arrangements for introductions to eligible young women. Ethan had never been certain of his own orientation until Liam. Looking back, he hadn't been close to anyone, male or female, before college. His interactions had been built on polite distance. Now that he was in a stable relationship, coming out felt like a practical solution. It would stop his parents from wasting their time on matchmaking and save some poor girl from being dragged into his mess. There was another, more pressing reason. His parents were powerful people in their field, the same field Liam was now trying to conquer. They had a history of overreach, from reading his diaries as a child to attempting to dictate his college major. He had fought them once and won, but he knew their reach. He and Liam weren't exactly hiding. He sometimes picked Liam up from his office. He brought him lunch. People in their circle knew they were together. Liam's industry was smaller and more incestuous than Ethan's academic world. If his parents found out through the grapevine, he knew them well enough to fear they might exert their influence, subtly or not, on Liam's company. It seemed safer for him to control the narrative. Someone had also commented that it would have been easier to order takeout for Valentine's Day. But the local options were often greasy and oversalted, and Liam had a sensitive stomach. Ethan had learned to cook at a young age, a necessity born of his parents' constant absence. He mostly made simple, home-style American food, but he knew Liam had spent a few years living abroad and assumed his palate might be more sophisticated. He guessed wrong about the fancy restaurant, it seemed. The thought that after all this time he still didn't know what food his own boyfriend truly enjoyed was a small, sharp failure. And the cigarette. Liam used to smoke, especially when work stress was high. Worried about his health, Ethan had gently mentioned it once. He hadn't noticed when Liam had quit, but at some point he had. When Liam had pointed out that the cigarette was unlit, Ethan hadn't understood the unspoken message. He had fantasized that Liam might have quit for him, but the idea felt too narcissistic. Liam was a man of immense self-discipline. He had likely quit for his own reasons. To ask would be to center himself in a narrative that probably had nothing to do with him, creating an awkwardness neither of them needed. The kindness of strangers on the internet, assuring him that Liam's actions showed he cared, was a balm, but one mixed with sorrow. He decided to continue writing, using the forum as a sort of diary to process the small, confusing moments of their life together. They weren't like other couples he knew who shared an easy intimacy. He had first met Liam when he was still a graduate student. His own department was small and underfunded, so his advisor often borrowed space from other faculties. For one semester, they were next to a lab where a group of undergraduates were working on a competitive project. Liam was one of them. Ethan was the one who confessed first, a reckless, impulsive act in a room full of their mutual acquaintances. He wasn't even sure if Liam was straight. After he'd spoken, a stunned silence fell over the room. It was Chris, a friend Ethan had known for years, who broke the tension, laughing and clapping Liam on the shoulder, explaining that Ethan had lost a bet in a game of truth or dare. The room erupted in relieved laughter, and Ethan, mortified, fled. He had heard rumors that Liam was not only straight but perhaps even homophobic. He had made a fool of himself and put Liam in an impossible position. He hid in the condo for a day, sick with shame. Then somehow Liam found him. He stood over Ethan, who was a mess on the couch, and his expression was unreadable. He asked if Ethan was someone who never joked. When Ethan remained silent, Liam's voice turned cold as he asked if he regretted it. Ethan could only shake his head, mute with misery. Logic dictated that this was his moment to apologize, to claim it was all a stupid prank, and smooth things over. But his heart betrayed his brain. He asked Liam if he wouldn't consider being with him. It took every ounce of courage he had. He expected to be thrown out. Instead, Liam agreed. The exact moment was a blur, a memory Ethan was afraid to examine too closely for fear of finding pity or annoyance instead of affection. But he had agreed. And Ethan, even knowing he had likely coerced Liam through a combination of public pressure and pathetic desperation, had been grateful. This relationship and his choice of career were the only two things he had ever truly fought for in his life. The first time he saw Liam had picked up a book of poetry Ethan had dropped, too mesmerized to bend down himself. Looking into his eyes, Ethan had felt a sense of falling. From then on, a quiet terror lived in his heart, the fear of losing someone he had never truly possessed. After the restaurant incident, things returned to a fragile peace, as they always did after a disagreement. Neither of them mentioned it. Then Ethan got sick. It started as a simple cold. And with Liam working around the clock on a major project, often sleeping in the spare room or at the office to avoid disturbing him, he didn't want to be a bother. He didn't tell him. But a cold, left untended, became a fever. One morning, Chris called. Their old university journal needed a last-minute article. Ethan, wrapped in a blanket and woozy with fever, spent the day rewriting an old paper and collapsed into bed after sending it, forgetting to take any medicine. The next morning, the phone rang again. It was Chris, his voice sharp, asking if he was sick. He must have mumbled something affirmative. Chris asked when he'd last taken medicine, and Ethan thought he said the day before yesterday. The next thing he knew, Chris was shaking him awake. There was a bowl of hot soup on his nightstand and a collection of pharmacy bags. Chris, using Ethan's laptop, was simultaneously berating him for the typos in the article he'd submitted and for his general lack of self-preservation. Chris, he should explain, was not just a friend. For a brief, strange period in grad school, they had been nominal boyfriends. It had been a purely platonic arrangement of convenience, a shield against unwanted advances for them both. The charade ended the moment Ethan met Liam, and it was into the scene that Liam walked in. He had never come home in the middle of the day. His expression, initially pleasant, soured the moment he saw Chris. The two of them had always circled each other with a kind of wary dislike, two different kinds of stars vying for the same sky. Liam ignored Ethan, his gaze fixed on Chris, demanding to know what he was doing there. Chris, unflappable, simply asked Liam the same question. Feeling a surge of panic, Ethan clarified that Liam was his boyfriend. Chris just made a non-committal sound and then turned to Liam with a slow, deliberate cruelty. So, he asked, his voice deceptively casual, "Why is it that you don't even know he's been sick for 3 days?" He watched the blood drain from Liam's face. Ethan tried to explain that it was just a cough, that he hadn't wanted to bother him, but the damage was done. Chris, as a parting shot, theatrically wrapped a heavy wool blanket around Ethan's shoulders, gave him a detailed set of instructions for the medication, and then patted Liam on the shoulder on his way out, telling him the soup was getting cold and needed to be reheated. The door clicked shut, leaving Ethan and Liam in a deafening silence. Liam looked at him, a long, deep look that Ethan couldn't decipher, then took the soup and walked out the front door. Not to the kitchen, but out. He returned a short time later, not with reheated soup, but with new bags from the pharmacy. He was surprisingly gentle, sorting through the medications, testing the temperature of the water before handing it to Ethan. Ethan thought for a moment that he wasn't angry. But that night, when Ethan went to heat up his customary glass of milk, Liam told him not to bother anymore. He also told Ethan to stop bringing him lunch at the office. He could eat out. The message was clear. He was angry. For days, Liam didn't come home. Ethan left the living room light on every night, a small beacon in case he returned late, but every morning the light was still on, the apartment cold and empty. He thought about their life in this city. He had been the one to suggest they live in his parents' condo, thinking he was helping Liam, who was just starting his company. He had wanted to introduce Liam to his parents, hoping they might even help his business. But Liam didn't want to meet them. He tried to cook for him, but Liam's tastes remained a mystery. He worked himself to the bone for reasons Ethan couldn't fathom. He felt as if he were looking at Liam through a thick fog, unable to see his joys or his burdens. He decided he had to let him go. When he finally caught Liam at home, he suggested they take a break. He phrased it carefully, saying Liam needed to focus on his work. Liam cut him off, his voice sharp. Lying, he said. You never used to lie. He demanded the real reason. Pinned by his intense gaze, Ethan told the truth. I don't think I'm good enough for you. Liam was stunned into silence for a moment. Then he let out a short, harsh laugh. He stood up, clapping his hands together once. Good that you know, he said, and went upstairs, leaving his dinner untouched. For a few days, nothing changed, except that Liam started coming home again, late, as his project neared its end. Then, one night, the phone woke Ethan after midnight. It was a man's voice, polite and slightly frantic. It was Liam's business partner. Liam was drunk, passed out in his car downstairs. Ethan hurried down. The partner, Luke, explained that Liam had been in a terrible mood for weeks, working like a man possessed. He said Liam had refused to go to a hotel, insisting on coming home, but then couldn't remember his own address. Luke had found it in the company's employee files and found an emergency contact listed simply as home. Once Luke had left, Ethan struggled to get Liam onto the sofa. As he brushed the hair from Liam's forehead, Liam's hand shot up and grabbed his wrist. He blinked his eyes open, and upon seeing it was Ethan, his grip loosened. Ethan told him he was going to make him some soup, that he should go to bed. Liam, his eyes closed, mumbled that he didn't want soup. Then, in a small voice, he said, I want milk. Ethan froze. He asked him why when he didn't even like it. I don't, Liam confirmed, his voice thick with sleep and alcohol. I want lunch. Ethan's hand stilled on his forehead. He reminded him that Liam had told him not to bring it. There was a long pause. Then, plaintively, Liam whispered, I told you not to bring it, and you really didn't bring it. Ethan felt his carefully constructed patience begin to crack. He told Liam he couldn't read his mind, that he could only go by what he said. He asked him what he wanted. Liam, his eyes still closed, began to list his demands. He wanted Ethan to bring him lunch every day. He wanted Chris to stay away from their apartment. He wanted Ethan to not get sick. He wanted to eat at home, to eat what Ethan cooked. And then, his voice barely audible, he added, Don't say you're breaking up with me again. Ethan spoke in a whisper, more to himself than to Liam. I'm afraid I'm dragging you down. Liam didn't respond for a long time. As Ethan was tucking him into bed, a muffled voice came from under the covers. Aren't I the one dragging you down? Ethan turned back from the doorway. He asked Liam what he meant. Liam's words were slurred with sleep, but clear enough. If it weren't for me, you would have finished your doctorate, gone to Cambridge, gone back to Boston. And then Ethan understood. The next morning, he told Liam he had to fly out for a last-minute seminar. It was a lie. He booked a ticket to Boston. The house was exactly as he remembered. Stately, quiet, suffocating. His mother was in the tea room, classical music playing softly from hidden speakers. She greeted him without surprise, as if she had been expecting him. She knew. She had found out about the article he had written while sick, knew that Chris had helped him, and was subtly admonishing him for his sloppy work. His parents had always known everything. He walked past the deliberately raised step between the foyer and the living room, a feature his mother had once explained was a threshold, designed to remind guests to know their place. He asked her directly if she had met with Liam. She didn't deny it, instead remarking on Liam's lack of subtlety. She told Ethan that she and his father were worried about him, that he was so unlike them, so unwilling to listen. She spoke of the condo, of Liam's fledgling company, of his lack of free time. It was all framed as concern, but it was a criticism, a judgment. She suggested other partners, girls from their social circle whose names he barely remembered, and then, shockingly, she suggested Chris. Anyone but Liam. Because Liam, she explained, couldn't possibly understand him or his world. Ethan finally understood the pressure Liam had been under, the impossible standards he had been trying to meet. His parents hadn't needed to make overt threats. Their disapproval was a weapon in itself. They had met with Liam and laid out all the ways he was unsuitable, all the ways he would hold Ethan back from the life they had planned for him. The life Ethan didn't even want. He told his mother he had made his decision. She looked at him with a familiar, weary disappointment. He was making the wrong choice again. As he turned to leave, his younger sister, the child they'd had when they began to despair of him, came down the stairs. She looked just like their mother. He nodded to her and then looked back at the woman who gave birth to him. He told her that, in their eyes, he had probably never made a right decision in his life. Then he walked out into the clean, cold air and called Liam. He confessed he had lied, that he was at his parents' house. "I want to talk," he said into the phone. That night, they finally talked. Ethan looked at Liam, really looked at him, not as the impossibly competent and confident man he had built up in his mind, but as the 24-year-old he was. Without his suit and glasses, his hair still damp from a shower, he looked young and uncertain. Before Ethan could even start, Liam spoke, his voice tight with anxiety. "You said you wouldn't mention breaking up." Ethan reassured him. He asked why Liam hadn't told him about meeting his parents. Liam looked away, muttering that Ethan knew how to provoke him better than anyone. Ethan pressed gently, asking why he shut him out when they were supposed to be partners. Liam shot back that Ethan hadn't told him he was sick, either. It wasn't an accusation. It was a defense, a crack in the armor. Ethan explained he hadn't wanted to add to his stress. Liam seemed taken aback by the simple, direct honesty. He finally confessed, his face flushing, that he had been working so hard to get his company listed on the stock market because he wanted to be worthy of Ethan in his parents' eyes. He was afraid that if Ethan brought him home, he would be embarrassed. He was afraid they would never accept him. Ethan shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "They never even accepted me," he said. "How could they accept you?" He realized then that he had never told Liam anything about his childhood, about the suffocating control disguised as love. He had been afraid it would bore him, or worse, that Liam would see him as weak. He would tell him everything later, but for now he just pulled him into his arms and kissed him. He didn't need to find a way to make his boyfriend love him. He just needed to accept that he already did. A few nights later, they were on the couch, the awkward silence of two people relearning how to share a quiet evening together hanging in the air. On a whim, Ethan suggested they watch a movie. Chris had recommended one called 7 Pounds. They watched in silence as the story of a man trying to atone for a tragic mistake by donating his organs unfolded. As the film neared its climax, Liam's hand found his. The final scene showed the recipient of the main character's heart meeting the man who received his corneas. As the chorus rolled, Ethan recalled something Chris had said about the film. In the end, he saw his heart through his eyes. Liam made a sound of agreement. Then, after a moment, he said, "I'm different." He turned to Ethan, his expression serious. "I'm luckier than him." He took Ethan's hand in both of his, lacing their fingers together. "I don't have to die," Liam said, his gaze unwavering. "I can see my heart with my own eyes. I am Liam. I was 18, a sophomore in college. I met someone. He had soft, dark hair and cool, clear eyes, and skin like porcelain. He was tall for someone from the South. In the spring, he always wore a crisp white shirt,